The 1947 Roswell incident may be the most famous UFO crash story of all time. But was it the first? On April 19, 1897, the Dallas Morning News reported that in Aurora, Texas, a mysterious airship had collided with the tower of Judge J.F. Proctor's windmill, causing a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. The Dallas newspaper even went so far as to claim that an Army Signal Corps officer had examined the charred remains of the presumed pilot, stating that in his professional opinion the dead pilot was a native of the planet Mars. While such an outlandish claim surely sparked a tabloid sensation, it may have also served a useful cover story distraction, since dead Martians can hardly be held liable for negligent property damage. But the smoldering spectacle of the Aurora mystery airship crash in 1897 was precursor to a more devastating airship crash that 40 years later would shock the entire world. Had the Aurora, Texas crash occurred in the absence of any other airship sightings in the area, then it would be much easier to consign this tale to the scrap heap of urban legend absurdities. However, the Aurora airship was by no means an isolated incident. There were numerous airship sightings, more than 30, reported in the North Texas region alone the evening before the crash. In fact, during the 1896 to 1897 time frame, numerous sightings of cigar-shaped mystery airships stirred a public frenzy all across the United States. Were these stories the product of unscrupulous newspaper reporters? Were these flying machines a secret military project subsequently covered up? It's often claimed that cutting-edge research, whether conducted by private corporations, governments, or individuals, may be many years ahead of general public awareness. And it must be understood that over the decades following the American Civil War, inventors from rival nations around the world were determined to be the first to ultimately realize conquest of the skies with heavier-than-air flying machines. Over the course of recorded history, man has envied the birds and their ability to fly. But this ancient longing to soar through the skies has only been fully realized over the last 200 years. By the mid to late 1800s, man learned he could take to the air with huge balloons. And while such an accomplishment held great charm and wonder, intrepid balloonists still sailed at the mercy of capricious winds, giving such air balloons little practicality as transportation devices. And yet, during the Civil War, manned balloons were pressed into military service for aerial surveillance. But in 1886, visionary French novelist Jules Verne wrote what was likely the first novel about UFOs, a mysterious object reported to be cruising in the skies around the world. Verne envisioned a fantastic, heavier-than-air flying machine called the Albatross in two novels entitled Robert the Conqueror and its sequel, Master of the World. With this fictional flying machine, Verne prophetically foretold the ultimate military potential of just such airships. And 1 decade later, a rash of actual reports of similar flying machines swept the American Midwest. To put this account in its proper historical context, we must first remember that the years following the American Civil War ushered America's entry into the Industrial Revolution, an age of quantum technological changes. Great engines powered by steam, coal, and oil drove iron ships across the seas, while iron locomotives thundered across continents. Vast industrial empires were spawned in America and Europe, all of which inevitably fashioned terrible engines of war to be deployed on a scale unimagined in human history. Given this climate of technological competition, it seems reasonable that certain innovations, particularly those regarding powered flight, be tested discreetly, since mastery of heavier-than-air flight machines held unprecedented advantage as military weapons. But whether the mystery airships of 1896 and 1897 were piloted by invaders from Mars, or ambitious flight machine inventors from planet Earth, remains to be seen. Either way, a rash of amazing reports from Chicago to San Francisco were making sensational press. In November 1896, a series of articles in the San Francisco Call headlined, "Strange Craft of the Sky. Sacramento men describe the airship, claim they saw its occupants and heard them in conversation. A winged ship in the sky. It cleaves the air with pinions like a huge condor. All Sacramento sees the new wonder." By the end of the month, the San Francisco paper claimed contact with one George D. Collins, attorney of the airship's inventor, who supplied the paper with drawings of the craft and further revealed as many as 3 ships had been constructed. 1 month later, this same San Francisco newspaper reported an unidentified airship over Los Angeles. 3 strange lights seen above the City of Angels. And 4 months later, in April of 1897, multiple airship sighting reports were featured, this time in the Chicago Record. Sightings all across the American Midwest: Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, and of course, Texas. People of Galesburg, Michigan saw a brilliant white light approach from the southwest. The object appeared large and black. With a crackling, sharp sound, it hovered close to the earth. Reporters state they heard human voices from aloft, from the airship. Witnesses from Everest, Kansas claimed the power source must have been attached to the light, for it dimmed as the ship went up and away. One observer states that there seemed to be a basket or car beneath a great dark object, thought to be a gas bag overhead. The car was shaped like a canoe and had 4 wings, 2 on each side, fore and aft. The light was greenish-blue. Colored lights seemed to be all around the car. And yet another report from Chicago stated, "People are tripping over themselves these days trying to get the best look at this green and white lighted giant airship that has had the people all over the Midwest in a dither." Scoffers claimed these people had seen Venus, yet all the reporters were people of substance and not given to reporting spurious stories. What stands out in the 1896 and 1897 sightings is that the UFOs were mostly cigar-shaped, piloted by men who frequently landed and talked to witnesses, usually asking for water for their machines. The most intriguing of the numerous contact stories involved a man who called himself Wilson. The first incident occurred near Beaumont, Texas, when on April 19, 1897, J.B. Ligon, the local agent for Magnolia Brewery, and his son Charles noticed lights in the pasture a few hundred yards away and went to investigate. They came upon 2 men standing beside a large dark object which neither of the witnesses could see clearly. One of these men asked Ligon for a bucket of water, and then the man gave his name as Mr. Wilson. He then told Ligon that he and his friends were traveling in a flying machine that they had taken on a trip out of the Gulf, and they were returning to the quiet Iowa town where the airship and 4 others like it had been constructed. When asked, Wilson explained that electricity powered the propellers and wings of the airship. Then he and his friends got into the airship and flew away. Subsequent reports that same month also confirmed similar encounters with a man named Wilson and his flying machine who asked Texas farmers for water and revealed additional facts about his airship. That its motive power was highly condensed electricity and that it was one of 5 that had been constructed in a small town in Iowa with the backing of a large stock company in New York. But apparently Wilson was reluctant to reveal much detail about his airship because he had not yet taken out any patents on his designs. On April 27th, the Galveston Daily News printed a letter from C.C. Akers, who claimed that he had indeed known a man in Fort Worth, a town adjacent to Aurora, Texas, named Wilson, that Wilson was from New York, that he was in his middle 20s, and that he was of a mechanical turn of mind, and was then working on aerial navigation and something that would astonish the world. With regard to how the Mr. Wilson reports relate to the Aurora crash, it was common in those early days to use highly flammable hydrogen gas to inflate the airbags for balloons, which may account for the violent explosion. But the fact that this UFO struck a windmill is even more curious, since Mr. Wilson repeatedly indicated the importance of water for his airship's power supply. Had one of Mr. Wilson's experimental machines malfunctioned before it could reach a water source? It seems absurd to think that a ship from Mars could successfully navigate 140 million miles across space only to smack into a Texas windmill once it got here. At any rate, by May of 1897, talk of unidentified airships mysteriously powered by electricity abruptly stopped. Despite such an unprecedented event as the crash of an outer space flying machine, investigators of the 1897 Aurora, Texas UFO incident swiftly gave the hapless dead Martian a Christian burial, then summarily dumped his wrecked machine into the water well of Judge Proctor's windmill, not even sending such exotic technology to the Smithsonian Institution for advanced study. Case closed. But was this UFO incident an appalling example of inept investigation or a deliberate military cover-up? Dead Martians cannot be held liable for negligent property damage. Considering the revelations of the mysterious Mr. Wilson, was it possible that the Aurora UFO was one of his unlicensed experimental airships that crashed on its way back to Iowa? If so, its crash would have subjected its designers and financiers to costly liability litigation, not to mention embarrassing public exposure for New York stock companies, if not the United States War Department as well. So, even to this day, there's strong suspicion that just like the Roswell, New Mexico crash of 1947, the truth of the Aurora, Texas 1897 UFO crash was also covered up. An important side note to the great airship mystery of 1897 concerns the work of eccentric inventor John Worrell Keely, who allegedly built an airship during the period of 1888 to 1893. And much like Nikola Tesla, Keely was noted for his work with radically unconventional propulsion technologies suggesting anti-gravity effects, which earned him the dubious reputation as a humbug charlatan by many. However, it was alleged that Keely staged a successful proof-of-concept demonstration of one of his airship designs to the United States War Department in 1896, a demonstration so successful his airship accelerated from 0 to 500 miles per hour within seconds. War Department officials were so impressed they immediately classified his invention, and so it remains to this day. But over the years just after Keely's War Department demonstration, mystery airship sightings continued to flourish across the entire country. It must also be noted that Keely's inventions caught the attention of wealthy financier John Jacob Astor IV, a contemporary to billionaire J.P. Morgan, who happened to be financing the exotic inventions of Nikola Tesla. A certain rivalry existed between Astor and Morgan, since it was known that Astor opposed the creation of a United States Federal Reserve Bank. So surely any free energy technology funding for Keely's inventions from Astor would have further antagonized Morgan. But any conflicting rivalry was permanently dispensed when John Jacob Astor died aboard the Titanic when that ship sank on April 14, 1912, a ship owned by J.P. Morgan. The following year, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the charter to the Federal Reserve Bank, and by 1917, J.P. Morgan ceased all funding to Nikola Tesla's free energy research. Consequently, over the ensuing century, with the rise of banking and petroleum industry monopolies, discussion of free energy and anti-gravity technology has been utterly stifled. But is it mere coincidence that in 1897, the airship sightings across the country began just 1 year after Keely's War Department demonstration? But by the end of the 19th century, there was no more mystery to controlled airships once they became powered by internal combustion engines. And the obvious weapons potential advantage of controlled airship development was ambitiously pursued both by visionary inventors and wealthy industrial profiteers alike. During the American Civil War, a young German army officer by the name of Ferdinand von Zeppelin served with the Union Army as an official observer. He was particularly taken by the use of aerial balloons, and after the war he traveled to St. Paul, Minnesota, where the German-born American Army balloonist John Steiner offered tethered flights. Von Zeppelin's first ascent in a balloon during this visit served to inspire his later interests in aeronautics, and over the ensuing decades, incredible giant airships built by Zeppelin became legendary. But over the course of World War I, Jules Verne's fateful prophecy of 1886 became deadly reality, as Zeppelin's great airships were employed as terrible engines of war, raining destruction upon England. The course of World War I likely revealed the true intent of airship design. The first global war staged on an industrial scale would press weapons innovations to new limits while generating unimaginable profits. And war would no longer be confined to soldiers fighting on remote battlefields. Mastery of flying machines could now bring death and destruction to civilian populations as well. Von Zeppelin himself declared that, loaded with 5 tons of bombs, the airship would become a flying battleship that could strike at the heart of the enemy. Fighter pilot defense against Zeppelin attacks on Britain were at first difficult, since conventional bullets failed to ignite the flammable hydrogen-filled airships. Only after special incendiary bullets were designed could the Zeppelins be successfully destroyed. But despite aerial attacks on England, Germany was eventually defeated, resulting in 2 decades of uneasy truce. But eventually, plans for an even grander German airship would inevitably take shape. In 1937, 40 years after the airship crash in Aurora, Texas, the whole world was witness to a far more spectacular crash that would bring the era of great airships to a tragic conclusion. Upon its completion in 1936, the Hindenburg was the grandest Zeppelin airship ever built. A masterpiece of German technical engineering, it proudly cruised over the Berlin Olympic Games with elegant grace, and over all the German heartland as well. But aside from an obvious German propaganda device, the Hindenburg was designed for practical transcontinental commercial aviation, a potential competitor for existing commercial carriers like Pan American Airways that already served routes from New York to Rio de Janeiro. Thus, on her final transatlantic flight, Hindenburg was under pressure to prove itself to investors as a profitable air carrier that could maintain reliable flight schedules. In fact, Hindenburg on May 6, 1937, was behind schedule on a transatlantic flight from Frankfurt struggling against capricious headwinds. At 7:25, while making her final approach to the Lakehurst, New Jersey Naval Air Station, the Hindenburg was suddenly racked by a spectacular explosion. Hydrogen outgassing near the tail section, supposedly ignited by static electricity, reduced the 800-foot-long Hindenburg into a blazing inferno in less than a minute. Of the 97 people on board, there were 35 fatalities, 13 passengers and 22 crewmen. One ground crew worker was killed as well, raising the final death toll to 36. Despite its imposing size, the Hindenburg was equally fragile and vulnerable. It was inflated with flammable hydrogen gas, and the coating of its covering fabric was equally flammable. But was the Hindenburg disaster really an accident? Subsequent FBI investigations revealed a potential Bolshevik saboteur suspect was among the passengers, and considering the volatile political climate of the times and Hindenburg's explosion in full view of newsreel cameras, suspiciously made the disaster spectacularly convenient as anti-German propaganda. As well, it seems to stretch credibility that a simple static charge would have disabled the Hindenburg when hydrogen-filled Zeppelins had logged innumerable flying miles of successful commercial service since 1910. Finally, it must be noted, United States law prevented the Hindenburg from using helium instead of deadly flammable hydrogen. Hindenburg designer Hugo Eckener sought to use helium, a less flammable lifting gas. However, the United States, which had a monopoly on the world's supply of helium, fearing that other countries might use the gas for military purposes, banned its export. After the Hindenburg disaster, American public opinion favored the export of helium to Germany for future Zeppelin designs, and the law was amended to allow helium export for non-military use. However, after the German annexation of Austria in 1938, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes refused to sign the final contract. Is it any wonder Germany became fiercely determined to seek independence from conventional energy sources monopolized by both the United States and Britain? The great airships of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were intended to bring an aura of stately Victorian elegance to manned flight. The creations of Ferdinand von Zeppelin, as well as the Hindenburg, remain the largest flying machines ever built by man. But it was a grand dream that would ultimately fade. These airships are also clumsy, dangerous, and eventually no match for the speed and efficiency of fixed-wing aircraft. As for the Aurora, Texas UFO account of 1897, it remains a tantalizing mystery. Was it truly an alien spaceship, or the secret free energy invention of mysterious Mr. Wilson, who, like his contemporaries, John Worrell Keely and Nikola Tesla, was also marginalized and suppressed by overwhelming petroleum industry monopolies? However, it is not the intention of this presentation to dismiss the authenticity of the Aurora, Texas UFO, but rather to place it in its proper historical context. The late 19th century was an age when man sought to conquer the skies, and numerous revolutionary flying machines were being tested across the United States and Europe. But of course, in 1897, even as today, not everything seen flying in our skies can be properly accounted for.